Happy Father's Day. How are we doing today? Doing great. All right. Well, I thought in honor of Father's Day, we talk about a bunch of guys who were terrible fathers and needed good dads. So we are continuing our series through the book of Daniel in Babylon, my home. And to catch everybody up, the events of Daniel take place about 500 to 600 years before Jesus is born. And what we have is this powerhouse of Babylon who has stormed through Mesopotamia, and they have gone specifically to Judah. They destroyed the temple, they subjugate the Jewish people, and they bring them back to Babylon. And somewhere along the line, they take the best and the brightest, and they force them into servitude in the royal palace. And so the book of Daniel is the story of one of these young men who have been taken captive and forced to serve at the behest of the most powerful men of his age, this man by the name of Daniel. Now, last week, we started chapter 5, and we are 20 years after the events of chapter 4, which we'll talk about in a minute. So, if you've been following along with us, this great leader of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is now dead. And in the 20 years that passed from chapter 4 to chapter 5, about 3 different dudes have sat on the throne of Babylon until eventually this guy by the name of Belshazzar has ascended to the place of leadership in Babylon. Now, on this particular night of chapter 5, the Medes and the Persians have surrounded Babylon, and they are attempting to seize the city and to conquer the great Babylonian Empire. But Belshazzar is completely unbothered by this. In fact, he is so unbothered that he's thrown a party for 1,000 nobles and powerful people just to show I am completely unbothered by all of this. He is convinced we are emergency proof, that there is nothing that can possibly stop us. And he had good reason to be, because the city of Babylon was surrounded by 4 incredibly massive, thick walls. And if that wasn't enough, the Euphrates River flowed to the city and around it, forming a moat. But not only that, they had a fresh water source of the Euphrates coming through the city, so that if they were under siege, they could withstand this onslaught for months if they had to. So he is trying to just communicate, hey, I am completely unbothered. Now, in the middle of this party, Belshazzar gets this idea. He says, bring out the gold and the silver cups that my predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And just to fill everybody in, these would have been the vessels that were used to worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God that we worship today. So he says, bring these cups in, we're filling them with wine, and we are going to honor our gods and honor our idols. And just if you are curious, Belshazzar is not oblivious to what he's doing. He didn't say, bring in the pretty ones. He singles these out specifically. And we'll talk a little bit more why in a minute. But within minutes of bringing out these vessels that have been consecrated and dedicated to the worship of God, something incredible happens. A hand appears, and only a hand. And on the wall, a finger goes and starts writing out 4 different words. And everyone can see this. And what leaves the tip of the finger are the 4 words of many, tekel, and parson. And the Bible describes that upon seeing this, Belshazzar, the king of Babylon at this moment, his face goes white. His knees start to knock. And he loses bodily control. And as I was doing some research into this, I'm like, what does this mean? And basically what the Bible is saying is he pooped himself, okay? Like he lost full control of all of his bodily functions, and he's that scared in this moment. But he's wondering, what does this mean? And for us, this story actually starts 150 years before the events of Daniel chapter 5. See, the Jewish king of Judah, Hezekiah, had become deathly ill. He was on the verge of death when God miraculously heals him and brings him to recovery. And on the other side of him feeling well and whole again, all of the surrounding nations start sending envoys to Jerusalem to pay their respects and to congratulate him on his recovery. one of which is this little tiny city-state that wasn't that big of a deal in the world by the name of Babylon. And as they come into Jerusalem, Hezekiah starts to really feel himself, and he wants to kind of show off. So he gives them a tour, and one of the places he takes them is the treasury. And inside the treasury, they see these items, these vessels, these articles that have been consecrated and dedicated to the worship of God on full display. And what's funny is this little nation state of Babylon, which had no influence at this point, was not of any particular size, just happened to watch it on this day. They take note. And they realize these Hebrew people, they got money, right? And so here's the thing is sometimes you have rich people who want you to think that they're poor, but a lot of times you have poor people who want you to think that they're rich. And Israel should have learned a lesson from this. Just kind of a, personal connection. When I was in college, I worked overnights at a convenience store, and it was probably the funnest job I've ever had. It was hilarious. Every night there was something fun that happened. And so one of these nights, I'm standing behind the counter and I'm ringing people up when this guy who I went to college with comes walking in the front door, and he's like, "Hey, I don't know if you noticed, there's a guy in the parking lot who is begging for money." And I'm like, "What, really?" And I look out, and I know exactly who he's talking about. It was a guy that I'd seen him do on a few occasions, but he was kind of a friend at this point. Like, he was around so often, he was a regular by the name of Dennis. And so I'm like, "Oh, you mean Dennis?" And right as I say that, Dennis comes walking in the front door, to which he watches me counting out all of the rest of the change to my classmate who had just lied to Dennis out in the parking lot saying, "Sorry, I don't have any money." Now he's watching as I'm counting all these small bills and change, and you could just watch the light come on. Like, my friend knew it, my other friend Dennis knew it. As soon as my classmate makes it out those front doors, Dennis stops his shopping, does a 180, and follows him right back out to ask him for more money. And the thing is, like, we all know that feeling, right? That there are times when it's probably just better if people don't know everything that you have. And for Israel and for Judah at this point, that would have been a better strategy, to not show off all of their incredible riches. The arrogance of King Hezekiah has now put them on the radar of a nation that is up and coming. And so as Nebuchadnezzar rises to prominence and starts to storm through Mesopotamia, he circles Jerusalem. Because for the last 150 years, the story's been passed along from leader to leader to leader, that if we ever have the power, if we're ever in a position, we need to raid this treasury. And so as Babylonian rises and Judah falls under their own moral decay, when the time is right, Nebuchadnezzar storms into Jerusalem. He goes into the treasury and into the temple, and he takes all of these vessels. And Nebuchadnezzar learns a lesson in the days and the years after this that is still true to us this very day. That you cannot take the blessings of God, or in other words, these vessels, without also accepting God's presence. And when it comes to God's presence, you cannot yield it to your liking. You cannot control him. He will do whatever he likes. And the first 4 chapters of the book of Daniel is Nebuchadnezzar learning this lesson over and over and over, that the God of Israel is not one to be trifled with, that he will exert his dominance when he needs to. And in chapter 4, God completely humbles Nebuchadnezzar. That he gives him the mind of a wild animal. He sends him outdoor to live amongst the wild animals, and he eats grass like he is a cow. And when God restores Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he writes this in verse 34 of Daniel chapter 4. After this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, so this is from his own mouth, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and I worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. His rule is everlasting, and his kingdom is eternal. All the peoples of the earth are nothing compared to him. He does as he pleases among the angels of heaven and among the people of the earth. No one can stop him or say to him, "What do you mean by doing these things?" Nebuchadnezzar's experience with the God of Israel has led him to this conclusion, that the height of man's greatness does not even register compared to God's. And the thing is, Belshazzar, in the middle of Daniel chapter 5, as he has brought these vessels in, as he started to worship his other idols and his other gods, and as he's now sitting in his own filth, scared to death of what many, many pekel and parson means, he is wondering, what did I do to bring this upon myself? But he doesn't have to search far because he knows the story of Nebuchadnezzar. He has read the words of Nebuchadnezzar, and he has thumbed his nose, and now he quakes at the writing on the wall. Now the story keeps going. It says in Daniel 5, verse 7, it says, "The king shouted for the enchanters, the astrologers, and the fortune tellers to be brought before him. And he said to these wise men of Babylon, 'Whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be dressed in purple robes of royal honor and will have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom.' But when all the king's wise men had come in, none of them could read the writing or tell him what it meant. So the king grew even more alarmed, and his face turned pale. His nobles, too, were shaken." Now, if this were the first couple chapters of Daniel, this would be the point where we just assume Daniel's going to come walking in, he's going to save the day. Because the last time we saw him in chapter 4, Daniel had a new title. He was the chief of the magicians. So as they're bringing in all of these wise men, Daniel should have been the one leading the charge, but he's conspicuously not there. And the reason why is because Daniel has been demoted in this change of leadership. Now, what we don't know is we don't know if this was rooted in racism, that maybe they didn't want any Jews of any kind of authority or prominence in places of power, and so they pushed them down to some bureaucratic role. We don't know if it was a game of politics, of whether or not the new king had his own people that he wanted to promote. All we know is that Daniel is not there, and the ones who've come in, they cannot interpret it. And now fear is starting to overtake them all. And the anxiety that is right here in this ballroom is starting to permeate the halls of government here in Babylon. I mean, you can just imagine for a second that for those who are still awake this night, as the city is surrounded by this alien nation trying to come in and take them into captivity themselves, there is start to becoming whispers around the palace that there's an emergency and nobody can seem to solve this. That the king has brought in all of the wise men, the enchanters, the astrologers, and they cannot decipher what's going on. That the king himself is terrified at what's happening. And you can just feel the anxiety that they're going through. That this new king, Belshazzar, who has tried to assert himself and promote himself to this place of supreme leader, is now left at a place where he's embarrassed. He cannot fix this. And you can actually see this playing out, that he wanted to portray himself as greater than this Israelite God. He wanted to portray himself as, I am greater than Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, I'm so great that while my city is attacked, I'm not even going to have my hands on the wheel. I'm going to throw a party. And now he's embarrassed by the loss of his bodily functions. He's now embarrassed by word getting out and for people knowing that something is happening. And now what's going to happen is his grandma, the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, is going to have to come in and bail him out. And so she comes in and she says this. She says, "There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor king, Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. This man, Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with divine knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So to top things off, the one person whom, and set yourself in the position real quick of 2,600 years ago, Middle East, a woman is now having to bail you out. This would have been incredibly embarrassing for Belshazzar. And to find out that the key to solving all of this is a Jewish man, the one whom you've been thumbing your nose at, the person who represents the divine figure that you have just said, "I am so much greater than." That's the one who's going to come and solve this. You have demoted him as well. You know, there's a special level of arrogance to not just take a step back when you're confronted with undeniable, brutal facts, right? Like to have it put in your face and to still not back down. That is a special level of arrogance. You know, 800 years ago, there was an English king by the name of John, and John was hated, like just supremely hated, and it didn't matter who you were. He had an approval rating of like 3, and those 3 were his mom, his wife, and him. Those were the only ones who actually liked him. And apparently, they described him as he was arrogant, he was brutish, and he was just generally disliked. So much so that in 1215, the nobles and the lords of England, they corner him and they force him to sign a document called the Magna Carta. But it does not matter that they've just restrained a lot of the king's powers. He's like, you know what? This doesn't apply to me. And so he stops following the rules almost immediately. And as the people start to come up against him, they say, like, "John, you have to follow these rules." He's like, "I will not." And he leads the whole nation into war. And it starts what's called the Barons' War. It lasts for over a year. And by 1216, he has spent every dime of the treasury, and he dies of dysentery. And the tragedy of the whole thing is it was completely preventable. Had John not just been so arrogant, the lords and the nobles wouldn't have had to corner him and force him to sign the Magna Carta. If he had learned his lesson and just followed the rules, he could have stayed in power, and he wouldn't have been forced out. And his arrogance pushes the entire nation into war, and he dies of dysentery, bankrupt. And I cannot stress this enough. Do you know how much better kings had it in the Middle Ages than everyone else? So much better. And completely on his own accord, he kills himself and he ruins his nation. And so fast forward, or rewind yourself back to 600 BC, and here you have Belshazzar following in the same pattern as this guy. He is a punk. He has not built anything. He was born on third base. He is not the great leader of Babylon. He simply inherited it. And whereas Nebuchadnezzar, when he is humbled, he learns something and moves on, Belshazzar, when he is confronted with the same facts, when he is humbled in the same way, he does not back down, he bucks up. And in verse 13 of chapter 5, it says, "So Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king asked him, 'Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar? I have heard that you have the spirit of the gods within you, and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. I am told that you can give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor, and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom.'" Okay, so from our perspective, we read this, and it sounds very nice. These seems like all of the right words to say. But here's a little secret. Belshazzar's words are dripping with condescension. That there is virtually nothing nice or honoring to what he was saying. Before Belshazzar has ascended to the throne, Daniel is the chief of the magicians. He has bailed out Babylon on not one, but like 2 separate occurrences. Like, he has been a very important figure that Nebuchadnezzar said, "This is the guy I want in my corner." And Belshazzar does not greet Daniel with, "Chief of the musicians, please help us out." He greets him with, "Hey, you're one of those exiles that we pulled out of Judah, right? And hey, I've heard that you can do some things." Like it's all implicitly there, but it's there. Belshazzar is not giving Daniel any respect in this moment. And so Daniel's response to this is basically, you can save it. I don't need your robes. I don't need your gold chain, because you're not going to make it out of this night alive. And then what he does is he walks Belshazzar through the history lesson from Daniel chapter 4 about how Nebuchadnezzar had also tried to assert himself to a place of prominence and tried to arrogantly declare to the rest of the world that there is no one like me, that I am the great and powerful Nebuchadnezzar. And this is how it ended. He lost his mind, and God sent him to live out in the wilderness like a wild animal. And here's the exclamation point to his whole speech. In verse 22, he says to Belshazzar, "You are his successor, O Belshazzar, and you know all of this. This isn't a mystery to you. Yet you have not humbled yourself. For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles and your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone." And just to give a little bit of commentary, he says, "Gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny." Belshazzar, you knew all of this, and you didn't change. You're not discovering something new in this moment. This isn't a history lesson that you slept through. You witnessed this. You have read Nebuchadnezzar's conclusions. It's one thing to say, "Man, I didn't know." Ignorance does not save you from consequences, right? You can do the wrong thing, but not really know that you shouldn't have done it that way. And you still have to kind of bear the weight of the other side of your mistakes. That's true. But it's a whole different thing when you know what's right and you don't do it anyway, because the patience goes right out the window. That's no longer ignorance, it's insolence. And just quite practically, to know better and to do it anyway is foolish. For those of you who've ever supervised anybody, right? You're a boss. And this happened to me a few years back. Do you ever get some information that you just wish you didn't know? You know what I'm saying? Where it's oh, I wish I didn't know that you didn't actually have a meeting, that you went to go see a movie instead, right? I wish I didn't know that. Or oh man, I wish I didn't know that you've been walking out with reams of paper every Friday for the last 2 years. I wish I didn't just figure that out. Sometimes knowledge feels like a burden. And maybe for Belshazzar in this moment, the knowledge of this felt a little bit like a burden. And Daniel's telling him, "Belshazzar, you know better. And since you know this, you have to do something with it. You've read the reports. You probably saw Nebuchadnezzar going crazy. And with that being the case, how dare you defy the Lord of heaven? He may not be Nebuchadnezzar, but because he saw the witness of Nebuchadnezzar, he's still held to that standard." And here's the way that I need us to view this, is that, like I said, sometimes knowing the right thing, knowing that little piece of information, it feels like a burden. But to know a better way is not a burden, but it's God's grace in our life. And the thing is that oftentimes in life, when we know the right thing, but we don't want to follow it, and we don't want to do it because we're just convinced that to follow through on the desire or to follow through on whatever bad plan we've got, we think that if I don't do this, then I'm never going to experience this. I'm going to miss out on it. And I don't want to miss out. But I just want to plant this seed in your mind. That, God has never held anything back from you out of cruelty. He hasn't. God has never held anything back from you out of cruelty. That when you look at the desires that you have and the temptations you have to try and shortcut God's wisdom or try and shortcut the rules, we'll put it that way, it's usually rooted in a desire that God is desperately trying to fulfill in your life, one way or another. And it's not that God is down from you having fun or trying to keep you from enjoying yourself. It's that God is down on your pain, and he knows that to try and go around God's wisdom and try and do it on your own terms, it's probably not going to end well. Now, the problem is that we all see people that they do things the wrong way, and it just kind of looks like, from our perspective, there were no consequences. But what we don't really look into is the fact that in usually those cases, they are the exception, not the rule. The more often than not, the people who decide, like, I'm going to take the shortcut here, I'm going to lie about this, or I'm going to cheat my way through this, or I'm going to jump the line, like, what happens more often than not is that leads in heartache and heartbreak. Now, yes, some people make it out unscathed, but that's not necessarily that they found a better way. It's just grace in their life that even though they didn't deserve it, it worked out fine. And it's not that God's trying to keep you back from pain. It's that God's trying to keep you back from fun or enjoyment. It's that God is trying to keep you back from experiencing the pain of those foolish decisions. And so when God gives us an example of somebody else who walked that path and it ends in heartache and disaster, to know better and to do it anyway is foolish. Now, this also includes this question right here, because sometimes what we do is we know better, but we pretend like we don't. And so the question that we all have to kind of wrestle with is this simple question right here of, what are you pretending not to know? Yeah, my dad did that, and I know things did not work out well for him when he did, but I think maybe it'll be different for me. And so I'm just going to pretend like it couldn't be avoided and just give in to what I want. Or, man, I saw this happen with that other person at work, but, I'm just going to avoid thinking about it, and I'm going to follow through anyway because it worked out well for this. Like, what are you pretending not to know? Don't just play dumb because you think it's just going to let you off the hook. To know better and to do it anyway is foolish, and this is exactly where Belshazzar is at this moment. He knows better, and he did it anyway. And so here's how the story ends. It says in verse 24, it says, "So God has sent his hand to write this message." This is Daniel talking to him. It says, "This is the message that was written. Many, many, tekel, and parson. And this is what these words mean. Many means numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end. Tekel means weighed. You've been weighed on the balances and have not measured up. Parson means divided. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." And then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was dressed in purple robes and a gold chain was hung around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So the reason why they couldn't really interpret it is that these 4 words that were written on the wall, they were not like mysterious words that they'd never heard or seen pronounced before. They were very common words, and they were words that were used for weights and measurements. What they couldn't quite figure out is why they were all just put together. It's wordplay. But here's the meaning that Daniel immediately spots through God illuminating it. God has your number. You are a lightweight. You are not measuring up, and God's going to split your kingdom. You wanted to put yourself in this position like, hey, you're incredibly powerful and nobody can touch you and that you are so much greater than everyone else. But the truth is, you're not. And this is the true epilogue to the entire Babylonian experiment. It says that very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So here's what happened. The Babylonians were very confident in their protections, right? 4 massive, thick walls, the Euphrates River creating the moat. Well, the Medes and the Persians, secret to the Babylonians, way upstream, started building a secret set of canals, and they were able to do it at such a magnitude that they actually lowered the level of the Euphrates River. And so as the waters began to lower down, this source of fresh water that flowed through the city, keeping them emergency-proof, was decimated, and the armies of the Medes and the Persians could just walk right underneath the walls and storm through the city. And keep in mind, the Babylonians were so confident in their protections that where were they during the middle of the siege? Well, they were throwing a party. And then where was their government? Well, they were trying to figure out what the meaning on the wall was. All the while, the Medes and the Persians were working upstream, lowering the water level to the place where their protections were nothing. And here is a simple reality for all of us. Man-made protection will never be safe enough. Because remember, the kingdoms of this world are the Most High's, and He will give them to whomever He chooses. So what do we do with all this? I mean, at this point in Israel's history, the Babylonians are no longer a factor, that their time is done. But now a new nation has come onto the scene, the Medes and the Persians together. But what can we learn from Daniel chapter 5? Well, here's probably one of the very first questions that we have to ask ourselves. Are we struggling with an arrogant spirit? And the way this manifests itself is, I know better, but I'm going to do it anyway. It comes out when I say, the way that I'm perceived by everyone else is more important than who I really am. This comes out whenever we see people as a means to an end and not as the person made in the image and likeness of God placed in front of us. You know, it also comes out like, are you bitter about what God has not given to you? Like, do you feel like God's trying to hold something back of extreme value and you're just so angry about it? Like, well, we are asserting ourselves in the same spirit as Belshazzar to say, I am better because I know better than the God who is orchestrating all things. Are there things that you know that you're just pretending like you don't? And then finally, the question we have to ask ourselves is, where are you placing your confidence and your security? The Babylonians were convinced. We have solved it. No nation will ever come and take us because we have built these walls so thick and we have surrounded ourselves with so much protection. But man-made protections are nothing compared to God. And so what is the alternative? Well, Proverbs 3, 5 through 6 say it this way. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all that you do, and He will show you which path to take. So as you trust in the Lord with all your heart, that means that you strip yourself of the arrogant spirit that says, I know better, I'm in control, I have figured this out, and you allow God to be the source of your confidence, your security, but also your decision-making. Remember, because I'm not going to depend on my own understanding, that I am, in all my ways, going to seek His will out, and I'm going to allow Him to show me which path to take. And it's not mystical. It's every day humbling ourselves and handing our lives over to God. Jesus would say that you have to die to yourself. that you have to take up your cross daily. And that wasn't just like, yeah, you got to wear the symbol of Christianity around your neck, because this was at a time before Jesus had ever actually gone to the cross. What he's saying is you have to put yourself in a position where you believe that God is the one who is over all things, that the kingdoms of the world are his, and he gives them to whomever he chooses, and I am just following along. So, as we contemplate what God would have for us today, I want us to go to the Lord in prayer. God, I'm praying today that if there is an arrogant spirit that lives inside of us that tries to assert ourselves to a place of prominence over you and over other people, that God, that you would strip that away from us. That God, that we would learn the lessons from the people who have come before us. That arrogance does not end in victory. Arrogance ends in defeat. And that God, instead, we would live out the Proverbs 3:5-6 methodology. That I'm going to trust you with all of my heart, God. That I'm not going to depend on my own understanding. In all my ways, I'm going to seek you and trust that you will show me which path to take. So Lord, I pray this in your son Jesus' name. Amen.